Why the European Union is faltering. Consider this. If you were born in the last 50 years anywhere within the current borders of the EU, you have lived your entire life in a Europe without wars between member states. And that would be the first time this has happened in centuries of European history riddled with endless conflict. For a continent that was the site of the most destructive wars in human history just 75 years ago. Europe, under the stability and integration of the EU, has experienced the longest period of internal peace between its major powers since the Roman Empire. That's how transformative the EU has been to interstate relations since World War II. However, today this unprecedented union faces challenges that threaten its very existence. In this video, I'll cover the history of the EU, its many benefits, the origins of today's tensions, and analyze whether the bloc can survive intact or if it risks coming apart at the seams. First, a quick history lesson on the origins of the European Union. Efforts at integration begin in the aftermath of World War II, which left Europe devastated and in need of rebuilding physically, economically and politically. The immense destruction wrought by two world wars originating in Europe in just a few decades convinced leaders that closer cooperation was needed to end centuries of conflict and competition on the continent. The EU's earliest roots stem from the European coal and steel community formed in 1951 between 6 nations: France, West Germany, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands and Luxembourg. The ECSC created a common market between these nations for coal and steel, two essential resources. The idea was that sharing materials vital for industrial production would bind the economies of often antagonistic nations like France and Germany together, helping prevent future war. This model was expanded to cover all economic sectors with the European Economic Community created in the 1957 Treaty of Rome, signed by the same 6 ECSC members. There was now a customs union with no internal tariffs, and free movement of goods, capital, services and labor. To administer this integration, new pan-European institutions were built, including the European Commission, European Council, European Parliament and European Court of Justice. Over the decades, the bloc continued to widen in scope and deepen in powers. More member states joined, starting with the UK, Ireland and Denmark in 1973. The biggest evolution came with the 1992 Maastricht Treaty, which established the modern-day European Union out of the prior EEC. The economic integration took another major step with adoption of the euro common currency in 1999, now used by 19 member states. The EU was last enlarged in 2013 to encompass most of the continent with 28 member states and nearly 450 million citizens. Among the bloc's core achievements are the establishment of a customs union and single market without internal borders. There is freedom of movement for EU nationals between member states. Goods, capital, services and labor move freely within the Union. EU institutions regulate many aspects of daily life, from product standards to air pollution limits to roaming cell phone charges. The Union has its own parliament, court system, central bank, currency, and extensive body of laws. Shared policies promote free trade, consumer protection, human rights, redistribution between richer and poorer regions, environmental standards and more. Citizens elect EU lawmakers and can freely live, work, study and retire anywhere in the Union. So in essence, the EU over 6 decades evolved into something akin to a continental super-state sitting on top of the national governments. It's far more than a loose association. It has many attributes of nationhood like borders, currency, laws and governance. This pooling of sovereignty and integration between European states is historically unprecedented in its scale and ambition. Now that I've touched on the history and nature of the European Union, it's important to also highlight the many benefits brought by this integration between European states. Here are some of the key accomplishments. By entangling the economies of historic rivals like France and Germany, tying peripheral nations into the broader EU community, and propagating shared democratic values, the EU has helped overcome centuries of war and division in Europe. Since World War II, conflict between EU members has become unthinkable. The EU has enabled the rebuilding of war-torn economies in Western Europe and post-communist states in Central Eastern Europe via development funds. A single market with free movement of labor, deregulation and trade. Average per capita GDP has risen from $11,800 in 1994 to over $38,000 today in the EU. EU citizens can freely live, work, study and retire anywhere in the Union in a borderless single market and common labor market. Over 17 million EU citizens live in another member state than their own. EU policies brought things like lower airfares, cheaper roaming charges, safer products, labeling standards, 2-year warranties, etc. The EU has expanded rights for women, children, minorities and other vulnerable groups. Its courts has limited the power of national governments. With common policies and 500 million people, the EU has negotiating clout and regulatory power on the global stage in areas like technology, climate change, trade and more. Richer regions help fund development in poorer areas via EU fiscal transfers, boosting growth and convergence. Over $600 billion spent on infrastructure, job creation, digitalization, etc. So in many ways, the European Union brought significant benefits that would have been difficult or impossible for individual European states to achieve alone. It tamed violent nationalism, supported democracy and human rights, enabled the free movement of people unseen for millennia. However, despite these many successes, the European project always had its detractors and today faces grave threats that imperil the whole integration experiment. The EU in its current formulation is now confronting deep-seated challenges it seems unable to overcome. Let's dive into the big issues. One of the foremost complaints is the perception that the EU and its institutions diminish the sovereignty of member states. Critics argue too much power now resides in Brussels while national governments lose control over key areas like borders, regulations and finance. Relatedly, the EU is seen by many as an elitist, complex, sluggish bureaucracy that citizens have no attachment to or input in. Having policies dictated by unelected bureaucrats breeds resentment. Poorer southern and eastern member states often chafe at the fiscal rules imposed by richer northern nations like Germany. This has bred resentment between the periphery and core. The common currency makes it impossible for states to devalue to regain competitiveness. It also inhibits each nation from controlling its own monetary policy or engaging in stimulus spending. The 2015 wave of refugees and migrants into the EU exacerbated fears of the cultural makeup of member states changing too fast. Conflict arose over burden sharing and EU quotas. Eurosceptic, anti-elite and nationalist parties like France's National Rally and Hungary's Fidesz have gained support. Right-wing populism fuels anti-EU attitudes. Nations like Poland and Hungary are seen as increasingly autocratic and flouting EU rules on media freedom, judicial independence, etc. But Brussels has limited tools to discipline them. It also shows it's possible to leave, fueling fragmentation worries. Terror attacks and conflicts in the nearby Middle East and Russia have raised doubts about the EU's ability to protect citizens. Desire grows for tighter borders. Taken together, these interconnected crises and tensions point to disillusionment with the European project in its current form. Solidarity between states appears to be weakening as nationalism reasserts itself and populist movements gain steam. The crises of the Eurozone, migration, rising inequality, terrorism, and more have left citizens looking to national governments for solutions, not Brussels. Often, the EU seems to lack the decisive leadership, coherence of vision, and agility of response needed in difficult times. Its one-size-fits-all policies frustrate many members. Brexit in particular highlights that forsaking national sovereignty to a distant central body is no longer an unquestioned good as it may have appeared in the prosperous early decades of the EU. So given these significant and perhaps existential challenges, what are some possible trajectories for the EU's future? With tensions hard to reconcile between demands for national sovereignty versus regional integration, one option is a two-speed Europe that allows a core of member states to pursue deeper federalization while a looser outer ring opts out of aspects. We see this emerging already with the euro currency and Schengen area. This flexibility could allow the project to survive and even expand. If nationalist movements continue gaining, EU powers could be rolled back towards national capitals over time. Rather than a federal superstate, the project shifts to become a mainly economic partnership for trade. Brussels has less sway over political matters within member states. In another rethink scenario, the EU could scale back the policy areas it oversees and ease up on rules and enforcement in areas of friction, like deficit spending limits or migration quotas. The Union becomes more of a regulatory union than broad political partnership. At the other end of the spectrum, rising populist parties embracing Euroscepticism and nationalism could ultimately gain power in several states. Demand grows for opt-outs from EU policies or even outright exits. Europe returns to nation-state primacy. A two-speed solution seems most probable, giving member states flexibility. However, a unified federal vision for Europe appears more doubtful now given ideological divisions. In essence, a looser, more fragmented and varied Europe.